Hello, everybody, and welcome back and happy 2022. This is our first lecture of the year in the Race and Technology lecture series from Microsoft Research. If you've been coming to past lectures, you know that we've had an amazing interdisciplinary breadth of topics, and today we are really happy to get to continue that with C. Brandon Ogbunu, who's an assistant professor at Yale University. Professor Ogbunu is in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale. He's a computational biologist, and he investigates complex problems in epidemiology, population genetics, and evolution. And he also runs a parallel research program at the intersection of science, society, and culture. And in this capacity, he's an amazing public intellectual, giving public lectures and curating media of various kinds. He's an ideas contributor at Wired Magazine, where he's written on a bunch of really interesting topics. And he's written for a range of other publications, including Scientific American, The Undefeated, Undark, and the Boston Review on topics where science and society and often sports intersect. He's also performed for Story Collider, was featured in an episode of Radiolab, where he's a contributing editor. And he was even in the Emmy Award-winning PBS web series, Finding Your Roots, The Seedlings. So if you were here in December and saw Sohini Ramachandran, she also spoke from computational biology. So those two pieces are going to go really nicely together. And if you haven't seen that lecture or any of the other ones in the past series, they are all available on our YouTube site, which you can access by virtue of being here now. So let me turn it over to Brandon. I'm going to be monitoring the chat. Please drop your questions and we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A afterwards. So thank you so much for being here, and let's go.
Greetings. My name is Brandon Ogbunu. I am extremely excited to share my work with you titled Towards a New Biology Nexus, Race, Society, and Story in the Science of Life. Before doing anything, there's just a number of individuals I have to thank that are too many to name individually. So it's kind of a whole library of people who've contributed to this work in various ways and contributed to organizing this tremendous lecture series. I want to acknowledge them and thank them for all that they have done for my career, and again, for giving me this stage to be able to share this work with you all. One of the great things about this tremendous series is, not only the number of incredible luminaries who are sharing their work, who we can all learn from, but the way that these presentations are in conversation with each other. And this is a point that Professor Ramachandran made. And so I'm incredibly frightened to follow Professor Ramachandran in one perspective because she's such a genius. But in another sense, I'm excited too because she did a lot of the groundwork, technical work, in laying the foundation for a lot of the problems that I will discuss today, as did Professor Tallbear. So this question about genetics, its intersections with society, really is a theme through several of these presentations. And so today you'll see some of those kind of resonance, that resonance manifest. And the goal today, to briefly discuss our scientific ambitions as a society, their technical and conceptual blind spots, and to propose a model for how to address them, right? So we don't have much time, only 40 minutes. And so really we will kind of briefly go through things. You'll kind of get samples and cases and models for how to think about some cutting edge problems about kind of technical innovation in biology and what are some of the ethical and societal problems that they cause and how we can think about them differently. Okay. And so this presentation will be divided into three parts. In part one, we'll kind of talk about where we are, so to speak. We'll kind of get a background or an introduction that'll kind of ground and level set with regards to how we think about the modern intersection between science and genetics. So 2022 is here. But interestingly, what I'll do, and this is a huge thrill for me, I will take this opportunity in 2022 to actually turn the clock back 25 years to 1997. And that's where my kind of inquiry into the types of questions we're asking starts, okay? And so what was I doing in 1997? I was a teenager, and so, my favorite athlete was Charles Woodson. Michigan fans will understand, American football fans. My favorite musician, right? Notorious B.I.G. My favorite kind of article of clothing that I will not lie and say that I owned. I wish I owned was an Averex jacket, kind of a really expensive leather jacket. But my favorite movie that came out that year was Gattaca, right? Yes, it's been 25 years, if you can believe it, right? And so, as many people know, right, Gattaca is kind of this movie that is one of the first movies that interrogated these bioethics questions at the intersection of genetics and society. And it's one of these films that I learned through the years has had kind of gotten mixed reviews with regards to how people thought about its relevance for biological and bioethical questions. But it was critically and profound. It was critical to my development and profound to me when I saw it. Okay. And it has stayed with me. And I think it offers us today a way to think about some of the problems and issues that we're experiencing. So what are some things that I dealt with? For example, this is the first movie with like a real genetic counselor in it. I didn't know what the profession was. And of course, this is Blair Underwood. The fact that he's an African-American man, of course, was very, very important for me at the time. But he serves as the genetic counselor in this film and kind of walks them through kind of what are the risks of having a baby that's kind of naturally born versus one that's kind of genetically engineered. Gattaca also had this kind of public relations campaign where this is actually a fake ad that they released about kind of how you can engineer your child with certain traits, which was kind of part of the theme of the film, right? And of course, they had this alternative ending that was not part of the formal theatrical release, but talked about kind of a lot of individuals with these illnesses, many of them with the genetic component. And it kind of talked about this relationship between their disorders, right? And potentially, in the case of Emily Dickinson, certainly, right, the gifts, right, that we revered them for, okay? And so it kind of it really was before its time with regards to thinking about these types of problems, right? But again, you talk to a lot of people about it, including a lot of my genetics colleagues through the years, and they kind of talk about nitpick some of the genetics and nitpick some of the science, right? And what I tell them is that it's not a movie about genetics; it's a story about discrimination. And I think that was very, very clear for me the first time that I saw it. It really is it's one of the few things that I've ever seen that really, really did a really nice job of highlighting the chief ethical perils about the genomics age with regards to how we think about difference. The film is about a character, right, who does not have the appropriate, they call him an invalid genetic background, and the way that he's treated through his life. And being a young black man at that age, having dealt with kind of police violence and having dealt with racial profiling in the manner that I had, it really, really kind of hit me in a very personal way. And without it, perhaps I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing now 25 years later. Right? And it asked questions, it caused me to ask questions about myself, right? And it really was the first time I thought about things like scientific racism. How do we use biology to encapsulate fate, inevitability, and value in our society, right? When I looked at the ways that I was valued or devalued at that time, and certainly my ancestors were valued and devalued at that time, again, I saw a lot of those things manifesting in Gattaca, and I saw them articulated quite well, right? But make no mistake, right? I think while films like Gattaca and a lot of kind of work that goes on in the arena of kind of interrogating bioethics and thinking about the problems involved with a lot of modern genetic modification technology, for example, which we'll get to, I'm a geneticist, okay? I'm trained in population genetics, and I'll argue with anyone that DNA is the most powerful parcel of information in the universe. I mean, I can't think of anything that does more, that works, that's powerful, that contains kind of all of this, the amount of magic that DNA does. Okay, and I will argue that, but I think just because it is the most powerful piece of information in the universe doesn't mean that there are things that we shouldn't be thinking about when we're considering what DNA is, what it can and cannot do, how we should be studying it, right? And in whether or not we should be modifying it. And if we can, right, what does that actually mean, right? And that's really what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about a need for a new perspective, as I call it, a nexus of perspectives, right, that involve us thinking carefully about technological innovations in the biotechnology space. We'll identify the conceptual and practical problems with these innovations. And I think this is key here. I think practical, a lot of the things that I'll talk about are conceptual and ethical, but they're also technological and statistical. I mean, really the things I'm talking about are in the context of cutting edge research questions. Okay, so I'm not an ethicist, I'm a geneticist. And so you're kind of going to hear me think about this problem from my own perspective. And that is who is delivering this presentation, someone who wants to do my work better. I'll try to offer a new model that allows for a more nuanced picture, and I'll identify the types of information that we'll need to engage to build this new model. All right. Next is our scientific ambitions and their blind spots. What are the technological ambitions of our time? I think Professor Ramachandran did a beautiful job articulating, right, a lot of this, or at least a lot of the statistical rigor that underlies it. I think they could be there's many biological, technological ambitions. But I think the big two classes, the ones we'll think about today, are about genomic prediction and genetic engineering. Now, genomic prediction, for those who remember the scene in Gattaca, when the protagonist was born and they took a drop of his blood and they dropped it in a machine and they said things like 99% chance of heart failure, 75% chance of diabetes, 27% chance of, right, and what have you. And again, this is, the science as it existed in 1997 or whenever that screenplay was written, right? I think they did a pretty good job thinking about the way that we're starting to discuss risk and prediction, right, with genomic information. And a lot of that is couched in a technology you might have heard that's called, polygenic scores or polygenic risk scores. And the idea there is you could identify, based on kind of parcels of genetic information and mutations and alleles that individuals carry, right, the correlation with certain phenotypes that we really care about, right? And we're really interested in that because, like the protagonist in Gattaca, we're really interested in, what our kids can do and whether or not I'm going to have the next LeBron James or the next chess champion or the next Sahini Ramachandran, hopefully, right? We want to have that type of control over our futures. And I think the notion of genomic prediction kind of gives us that power. And this is one that we really are living in right now. Relatedly is genetic engineering. And obviously the technology and the science underlying these two things is quite related. Genetic engineering, and I've just kind of put a superhero. I mean, Black Panther isn't actually genetically engineered for all my superhero fans in the audience. But, genetic engineering is the notion that we can manipulate genetic information, right? I already said it's the most powerful piece of information in the universe, to get desired outcomes in phenotypes, okay? Now, I think there are framings within genetic engineering that are kind of, artificial selection, for example, which has given us, our domesticated animals, and certainly agriculture as a type of genetic engineering or genomic engineering. I think that's been happening, or genetic modification, as some people would frame it. But when we talk about genetic engineering, we're really talking about this modern age where we can actually tune genes at an individual, nucleotide level, presumably to get outcomes that we care about. And of course, the relationship between this and this is that, okay, well, maybe I can engineer the children to be the next LeBron James or the next Sahini Ramachandran or both, right? That'd be interesting, okay? Maybe we can kind of, right, if we have enough of a handle on what genes are doing and what mutations are doing, and we can change them, right, we're presumably able to wire the fates of our offspring and loved ones and what have you. This was, of course, what manifested in the film Gattaca, right, where one child was genetically modified and the other one was not. And the central conflict of the film was about how the one that had the kind of desirable traits was treated much, much differently than the child that was not. Okay. And I think this is kind of how we can think about what these kind of big ambitions are. Now, I think in both of these cases, it's important to note that there's a lot of awesome things that can come from this, right? So the notion of genetic and genetic disease, certainly ones that are Mendelian risk factors for certain diseases. The notion that we would be able to identify risk factors for them so that we can prepare for them is a beautiful thing. Similarly, with genetic engineering, right? There's certain diseases that are caused by mutations or small suites of mutations that can conceivably be engineered out of human beings. But the problem was most things we care about are much more complicated and the issues are much larger, right? And so really what we're talking about when we're talking about manipulating DNA or being able to predict is this kind of concept of essential dogma. This is the flow of information, a simplified version that we use. We oftentimes learn this in grade school. And that DNA, right, gets transcribed in RNA, gets translated into protein, and proteins, of course, kind of help to the notion is that they're the ones that's building the organism and responsible for the physiology and what have you. And that's kind of the central dogma, the central kind of conception. And what genomic, prediction says is that, okay, well, based on what I have in the DNA, I can use some kind of algorithm to predict what kind of protein and what kind of organism I'm going to get. And what genetic modification says is that I can tweak this DNA to get some kind of desired outcome, right? Right. So when we think about these chief technological ambitions, right, there's a lot of good that can come from them, but there's also a lot of conflict and controversy that can come from them. Okay. So here you see in the middle here, right, the conflicts around GMO and the idea that whether or not it is appropriate for us to be engineering our crops with desirable traits, right? And I think, GMO has the possibility of helping a lot of people, from one perspective, and the other, right? Do you want corporate interests driving? Right. And when you have kind of capitalism thinking about the food and what's good for storage and what's good for transport, is that necessarily serving kind of the nutritional needs? I mean, these are the types of conversations that are being had here. Certainly with human editing, and that manifested in Gattaca, we see that. But we've already seen genetic discrimination playing out in life. Right. And so the idea here is this is not a theoretical thing, right, or a fictional thing. These types of conflicts and controversies manifest. One slide you do not see here is kind of human. You do, but this was actually predated what was happening, right? This is 2015. Now you have kind of modern cases where we actually have modified human embryos. And so the idea is this is a real and current and contemporary problem that we're dealing with now, right? But when we think about the blind spots to these problems, I can think about them with regards to three classes. There's three things that we struggle with that are in part responsible for why we're getting this stuff so wrong, right? The first class I'll call incorrigible categorization, our seeming need to put things into neat boxes in order to understand them. Now, of course, that makes sense, right? I think breaking things down, whether it be species, all right, in my case, I have the unfortunate identity of being a New York Knicks fan. And that's caused me a lot of despair. But the idea here is that is a part of my identity. That is the way we have discretized individual teams based on geography. And kind of a lot of our identities are framed that way. We can think about this individual a bunch of different ways, right? Dr. Sanat Yitbarek, a colleague of mine, we can think about him with regards to where he's from, which was Eritrea, or where he lives, which is North Carolina. We could talk about being black, whatever that means. We could talk about as an individual who wears glasses. There are a lot of types of ways to think about describing this individual. And of course, this is Ronald Fisher, one of the founders of population genetics, and also a very, very renowned eugenicist who kind of authored deeply lamentable ideas about kind of improving the human species. So the idea is this notion that we can kind of put human beings into bundles or anything into bundles and understand them is just something that we continue to struggle with. Now, the question with regards to categorization is not that, I think that's probably true, that human beings will always put things into categories. The question is which categories, and do we imbue those categories with value relative to others, all right? Another thing is I'm a New York Yankees fan. For those who don't know, that's baseball, an American sport. And I'm going to tell you right now, right, the category of people I like the least on earth are Boston Red Sox fans. And I think that's unquestionably clear in terms of my priorities when it comes to categorizing people. I think, hopefully, more than I categorize individuals by virtue of race. The second kind of conflict we have in thinking about these, that kind of undermines our ability to really do responsible work in genomic prediction and genomic modification is this concept called giddiness. I got this term from population geneticist Doc Edge, really brilliant population geneticist. And really what it describes is this faith-based positivity that the science of genetics will get us there eventually, right? There's a lot of reasons for this, and a lot of really smart people have written about kind of the history of genetics. But genetics has been one of these fields that had a lot of, you might say, beginner's luck in the case of Mendel, and certainly a lot of the kind of early experimental geneticists that followed. And we tend to think that, okay, well, if we just keep doing more genetics and collecting more data, we'll solve this. One term to describe this is kind of like a type of physics envy. We want everything to be able to fit into a bunch of neat equations that we could use to describe fate and how tall someone's going to be and how smart someone's going to be and how rich somebody's going to be and what have you. And it turns out that genetics isn't really working that way. Nonetheless, there are a lot of really smart people, Robert Pullman being one of them, who really are insistent on this as a way to really think about society in a rigorous way. I think that this is a bit of a blind spot. And lastly, the environment as confounder. What I describe as unimaginative takes on what an environment is and our penchant for treating it as a confounder. This is where we'll focus today. And this is a big problem, right? Now, what do I mean by this, okay? Right? When you say something is an environment, and we talk about the notion of a gene by environment interaction. So you have a gene of some kind that you've inherited from a biological parent, and that's kind of interacting with the environment of some play. If you're very tall, for example, and you grow up in a place without basketball, right, maybe your lifestyle, your life outcome will be different than an individual who was, for example, right? Your environment is going to dictate things about who you are and what your kind of lot in life is. But when we think about environment, it means a lot of different things, doesn't it? And I think, right, geneticists like me think about it in a bunch of different ways. Some of us try to think about it in a mathematical way. This is kind of a classical equation, the Fisher equation, all right, that describes kind of how phenotypes that we care about across a population vary. Another definition, maybe we call this microenvironment. That's how things like temperature influence how the proteins in our cells are folding. Another conception of the environment is kind of this one. It's kind of more climactic across the world. Of course, this is, going to be temperature or maybe even, sunlight exposure. This is going to be things that kind of vary across the world. So that's kind of an environment. Certainly when thinking about climate change, for example, this is oftentimes the type of framework that you're thinking about our environment. Then there's this one, right? For those that don't know, I'm from New York City. This is the Queensbridge houses. I'm not from Queens. This is home to some of the greatest artists to ever live and some of my intellectual heroes, right? But this is a place where individuals live, and living here, and why is there so many talented people that come out of this housing complex? People like Nasir Jones, right? What is it about this environment and this milieu that seems to create these people who are so gifted with words? It's a good question. And then, of course, there's environmental things like this. Okay. This, of course, this is an individual in Oklahoma City, I believe in the 1930s, drinking out of a segregated water fountain. Right? And this history is a type of environment. And so the environment in which our genes are operating has many dimensions, has many different dimensions, right? And insofar as the environment encompasses a lot of things, we can ask this question. What is an environment less context in which we could study the enormous powers of DNA? So, for example, I just told you all this about the environment, but maybe you're saying right now, all right, that's all fine and dandy, Brandon, but I just want to know what this gene does. As in, I don't want to think about quantitative genetics or physiology or climate, or I don't want to think about history. I don't want to think about that. I have this gene that I've isolated in a population, and I want to know what it does, right? So what is the experiment that you can do to identify what a gene or a set of genes is doing without an environment? If you have an answer, you're wrong, right? Because that's a rhetorical question. There is no gene, there is no piece of DNA in the history of the universe that has ever functioned without an environment. Every single statistical effect, every single experiment every piece of DNA in every cell that's transcribing at every second, that's translating at every second, every signal transduction pathway in every cell, always every virus that's bonding to a cell is functioning in an environmental context. Every developing embryo has its own environmental context, right? And so the idea here is that there is no DNA and studying of it without a particular environmental context, right? Consequently, the framing of the environment as merely a confounder of the truth, as in there's a thing that a gene does or the genetics do, and we just want to kind of regress away the environment so that we get to the truth. That's just wrong. That's just wrong, right? I mean, it's not, that is technically wrong. It's conceptually wrong. It's wrong from every direction. Consequently, what I argue is that thinking carefully about these types of environmental dimensions is a part of thinking about the powers of DNA. Okay? It's a part of thinking about DNA, right? So, for example, this is a little bit of this genetics of type 2 diabetes is a mess. It's older now, and I think the genetics of type 2 diabetes is a bit, it's good. It's a bit better. But overall, I think that the arguments in this article hold. And the idea here, I outlined why basically identifying a slam dunk single gene for type 2 diabetes is a disaster. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work. And right, that relates to this part about, are we being misled about precision medicine? Here's what's interesting. I'll defend precision medicine, and I'll defend the genetics of type 2 diabetes. There are genes that underlie type 2 diabetes unquestionably, and there are genes that we could use to help treat diseases carefully. The problem is, it's not that we're studying them wrong, it's that all the individuals with type 2 diabetes that acquired it in their own environment. And so the environment isn't something like there's no true genes for type 2 diabetes. It's that individuals with type 2 diabetes have their own set of contexts going back to history that very well might influence the way their disease manifests. And the same thing goes for precision medicine. As in the environments as key pieces of biological information that need to be part of. So the reason why this is a mess is because this person, and I'm not criticizing the author because it's a nicely written point. The author's making a point, which is a good point. But I mean, it's the concept that the genetics may not be a mess. It may be that the phenomenon is a mess relative to what our conceptions are for the way genes are supposed to work. So maybe we have to change and not nature. Okay. Same thing here. Carl Zimmer, the great Carl Zimmer wrote this fun thing about genetic intelligence and genetics. Same thing, right? Like, are there genes that underlie kind of cognitive processes, and could those very well contribute to the way some individuals are able to compute or process information or add or write or what have you? Of course. But the idea here is those are all that cognitive processing is taking place in a brain, in a skull, in an individual, in a society. Okay? And so if an individual is in a society, right, where they've been told that they're devalued, for example, do you think that might influence the way that cognitive processing works? Of course. What I'm telling you sounds obvious coming from my mouth, but that is not the way that we've thought about genes. Okay? Right? So what do we do about this problem, right? And the problem, kind of to recapitulate, the problem here, again, is you have all these innovations that we want to make that involve our ability to go from DNA, this most powerful piece of information in the universe, and I stand behind that. We want to be able to go from there. We want to be able to do sets of things, like, for example, do a sequence and be able to say, am I going to have a LeBron James or a Professor Sahani Ramachandran or both? Am I going to have, right, these kind of capacity or disease risk things, of course, which are, important and powerful and can help a lot of people. We want to be able to do that. So that's kind of the genomic prediction side. And the other end, we want to be able to get in here and tinker with this thing to get phenotypes that we like or that are desired, not unlike the individuals in the film Gattaca. Okay. How do we act, right? The problem, of course, is that we're not thinking carefully about when we detect genes associated with a certain disease, the individuals who we detect them in have their own environmental context. We need to learn to kind of think more carefully about what those environments are, right? And I think until we do so, we're always going to kind of run into some of these problems, right? And so we'll think about towards what this nexus is. And what this nexus would be is this model of framing or thinking about modern genetic problems that allow us to more responsibly address these issues, so that we're not making the mistakes that were outlined in the film, and of course underlie problems like scientific racism. Right? I'm suggesting a rigorous embrace of the humanities and social sciences, as they have studied environments for centuries. That's precisely what fields like sociology, for example, have done. They are about social processes and their consequences for people. Fields like history, for example, are about how we arrived where we are. That's precisely what that field studies. So, right. So, for example, let's look to a study that was covered in the New York Times that studied how black men consistently earn less than white men, regardless of whether they're raised poor or rich. Fascinatingly, their genetic siblings, black women, right? There's no such gap between them and white women. Okay? And this basically talked about kind of some of the deep, deep trouble that black men are in modern society. All right. Now, what are the potential explanations for that? There's many, right? You can blame video games or music or what have you, all the kind of usual suspects, right? But it's important to think about this type of result carefully, right? These disparities that remain can't be explained by differences in cognitive ability. So, again, going back, do I think that there are genes that may underlie why some people are able to compute things faster than others? Perhaps. But those traits, even if they do have an underlying genetic architecture, manifest in a certain context. Okay? So some people cite racial gaps in test scores that appear, and they say that this is because of some kind of intrinsic inferiority in one group for another. And this person, right, David Grusky, points out, if such inherent differences existed by race, you've got to explain to me why these differences aren't handicapping women. As in, the issues are so much larger, the gap is so much larger between black boys and white boys than they are between black girls and white girls. Black boys and white girls are genetic siblings, so genes cannot explain that. That is a kind of a signal to you that there's an environmental factor that is bending this phenotype, in which case, right, in which case is earning potential, right? This is the phenotype we're interested in. There's an environmental signal that's doing that. And what could that be? Well, this is where we rely on some of these disciplines who think carefully about this, because geneticists surely don't. Okay? Right? Geneticists surely don't. And they kind of explore some of there's some statistical signatures of what these might be. What they found is that when it comes to fathers, neighborhoods where fathers were present, poor black boys did well in such places whether their own fathers were present or not. That is, the presence of fathers in a neighborhood as an environmental factor influence the outcomes, influence this phenotype independent of what the genetics was, right? And it specifically influenced the outcome for boys. And so the idea here is, right, when you embrace the humanities and social sciences in this manner, right, they tell you something meaningful about something that might have genetic underpinning. So for what we're saying is that, are we saying that genes have no role in why some people have talents that may very well be associated with them being able to earn a lot of money? Or are we saying that genes don't play a role in, educational attainment, which is one of the ones people look at now? Perhaps they do, but those genes that are responsible for that cognitive processing, right? It's just start of a conversation and not the end of one, okay? And in order to kind of really, really understand what's happening in society, you must rely on a rich interaction between these things, all right? So we talked about kind of that example in the humanities and social sciences. But what else can we do that can kind of help to complete our picture of how we can understand more rigorously the relationship between genotype and phenotype, or, more specifically, more precisely, differences in the phenotypes that we care about? What can we actually look to? And here's where I argue, and I step outside of kind of, the technical sciences at all, really, and I go more towards art. And I think the use of story to emphasize how environments create the phenotypes that we care about. I think it's stories tell us the things that are meaningful. And what do I mean by that? Right? I talk a lot about my experience, or I talk about experiences, and the way I've done that is through various kind of organizations and media outlets, and I do a lot of writing about not just my experiences, but about experiences and the things that influence them and the way they interact with kind of our genetic selves and our intentional selves. So I write a lot about this. But even me and my ability to talk to you all, and certainly be able to stand up and talk to these fancy people here, am the product of my own type of environmental trajectory. Okay? This is my mother. Talk about genes and environment. I think we're about the same age here, and look how much better she looks than I do. Okay? So why do I have the individual? And we're not from Oklahoma City. I think she's from Baltimore, and our enslaved ancestors are from the Carolinas, we believe, even though we have some work to do to figure out more. The reason why is that when my mother, who was raised in Baltimore, was a young girl, she experienced Jim Crow when she went to visit her relatives in the Carolinas. And she interpreted it the way many young people interpret stupid rules that adults have. She was just like, whatever, when she had to go sit at a certain part of the bus. But the point is, this is the person who raised me. She remembers these forces very, very clearly. So what I'm saying is, do you think that the fact that she experienced this might have influenced what she was capable of doing in life, independent of what her cognitive gifts were? Right? Right? Do you think that might have played a role? Right? And so this is where we think. We think about multiple generations, genetic relatives here. What is the kind of role that our context plays? I did not experience this. I certainly experienced racial profiling. I wonder if they will. I wonder if they will. And this is the things that we think about. You look here, right? This is my mom, the same woman, getting her master's degree. When I got my doctorate, I became the most educated person in the history of the family. Now, here's the key. She did this with no help whatsoever. The question is, which I don't understand, but the question is, to what, right, do you actually attribute her ability to go this far and my ability to go as far as I've gone to genetics? Is that an honest thought that you have? Because if that is your thought, you should be ashamed of yourself. Not because it's offensive, but because it's stupid, right? Here I am, able to do these things, not responsible for any children, and have all of the support in the world. And I bet that you can look in everybody's story for any phenotype we care about, from disease phenotypes to behavior phenotypes to what have you, and you have the type of environmental signature that contributed to it like this, right? And so what I argue is that in a nexus biology, we it acknowledges an appreciation for the powers of DNA, right? We don't have to discard with the utility of DNA, right, for our new model. But we acknowledge that no parcel of DNA has ever functioned without an environmental context. It's never happened, okay? It involves an embrace of the humanities, social sciences, and other disciplines that have interrogated what the environments are. I just talked to you about, regardless of what my mother's gifts were, she experienced things upon which where those genetic gifts were manifested. And then, of course, the use of our personal stories to highlight the role of context in shaping the phenotypes that we care about. Again, I can chart in my family the way in the environment has manifested and its specific role in shaping, right, disease, behavior, mental health, and these other types of phenotypes like earning and income, okay? And so I argue that the next generation of biology should integrate these into a new type of central dogma that rigorously integrates them, right, towards a new appreciation and model for how to think about life. That's my presentation. I'll be answering questions, and so if you've put questions or comments in the chat, I'm happy to discuss them. I thank you so much for your time and look forward to interacting with you.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful, just wonderful. I was backstage channeling, telling you I was getting some backstage fan mail there. We do have a couple questions, and I got a lot of questions myself. Clearly, anybody who is demanding a rigorous embrace of humanities and social sciences from where you sit is a man after my own heart. But I'll try to avoid doing too much gushing and remain on the topic.
Stop.
Let me start off. We have a question from Nikhil Kotecha. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, Nikhil. I apologize. The question is, hi, Dr. Ogbunu. Thank you for a fascinating talk. How are you thinking of how epigenetics layers onto this conversation? And also, great Twitter handle.
All right.
Big
Okay.
dedication.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the compliment, for the thank you. Yeah, thank you for the great question. So epigenetics is it's one of these really, really important things, and I think about this a lot. And this is not a question I get a lot, but I think this comes up a lot as I'm thinking about this. So, for those that don't know, epigenetics is this really fascinating phenomenon in modern genetics, whereby environmental signatures or experiences kind of can leave this physical imprint on DNA and kind of change the way genes are expressed. And so it's a very direct, almost Lamarckian, in the case of the way that the environment can actually change the way DNA functions. Couple of things. Number one, I think that's still, we're learning more and more and more about it. I think we just have a lot more to learn before we can rigorously say powerful things about the way that epigenetics is influencing big diseases or big outcomes like the ones I articulated. So I think that it is a powerful force. I think it clearly manifests. I think there's kind of, transgenerational kind of epigenetic signatures. So the potential is there. Here's what I think we need to be careful about. If the environment can tune genes in this type of epigenetic fashion, you are still attempting to explain a social phenomenon via biology. Okay? And what I've articulated to you, which might be true in some cases, but in some ways, it can still excuse away a lot of problems in our society. So, for example, you look at the way schooling happens. If you take school A and school B, and school A is a poor performing school, and school B is a good performing school. What a lot of genetic determinists would say is, oh, well, the high performing school is because the kids just have better genes. So therefore, why should we invest funding in each of these schools equally, right? That's the kind of cartoon example I'll use, right? But let's just say I'm against that. I go, that's definitely not true. It's epigenetics. An epigenetic explanation would say that the poor performing school is performing poor because of some epigenetic signature that has changed the performance. In both of those cases, you have a justification to do nothing, right? In terms of actually, you have a biological explanation in both cases. So what I'm saying is, I think we need to be careful about what we do with the conversation around epigenetics. I know a lot of social scientists like it because it has this idea of, oh, experience is actually doing something in biology. And that's true, but you still have to be careful with the way you interpret epigenetic understanding. So in summary, very exciting topic, very important thing. We need to be very, very careful with how we interpret epigenetics as an explainer of differences in a population. And I hope that made sense. Great question.
Thank you. Let me switch to the other side of the causal equation, or staying with the causal question. Mary Gray asked the question. She, like me, loved the clarity in how to think about what constitutes the environment, and she gives you in all caps, thank you. Mm-hmm. Her question is, what do you consider the places where we can draw causal influences between DNA, and specifically its impact on an individual's medical predisposition. So how would we have personalized medicine if it depends on finding causal relationships between gene sequences and particular disease expressions?
Yeah, so I mean, let's go back to what the promise of personalized medicine is, right? It says that, and it, and there are situations where it works, and let's think about where it works and why does it work, okay? The idea is there are many, many diseases, right, where there are very clear, if you take all people with a severe disease of some kind, and I think sickle cell anemia is the historic one that we all learned, like to the point about school equality. Some of us learned it in 6th grade, some of us didn't learn it in college. Okay, but we learned it at some point, okay? But the idea
some of us didn't learn until our friends got it, yeah.
right, exactly, right, exactly. You take that one is so clearly, you take everybody that has it, there's a clear genetic signature. There's a reason why it's an exciting find that we've actually now, we think we can actually use modification technology to kind of remove that from the population, conceivably, right? I mean, I don't know how, we have to think about what that means generationally, but in terms of biomedically, the notion that you can have a generation of people without that problem is a beautiful thing. And that works because that disease is relatively simple to identify the genetic roots of. So I think in that situation, I feel much more comfortable with causal language, right? Because but that's the thing. Even in sickle cell anemia, do you think everybody with the presumptive gene has the exact same experience with disease? No, they don't. You have a wide diversity of experiences with that disease with the same piece of genetic information, to the point we're making. So my point is this. I think personalized medicine, right, in situations where you have a gene that is strongly associated with a phenotype, I think it has powerful ways to help people. But we must acknowledge, even in those diseases, there's going to be other things that manifest. Do you think if you are born in Mississippi 200 years ago, take the exact same genotype and then put that in now in New Haven, Connecticut, where I have access to the best medical care in the world, you're probably gonna have a completely different experience with disease, right? Because now we have a lot of therapies, it's gonna be much different. So I'm saying this to say, personalized medicine exists. Personalized medicine is going to help a lot of people, but even personalized medicine is going to have to take the context of the person into account if it wants to effectively and responsibly treat them for a given, even genetic disease, where we do have a causal relationship between genes and disease.
Great, thank you. We've got a quick follow-up. Is there an example of a disease with genetic roots that links to behavioral or mental health?
Ooh. Well, so I think one answer is all of them. Roots. But this is a really good question. So I think a lot of, so I think, and if you hear me or see me write about this, don't roll your eyes, because these are a couple of powerful examples. I think so. I taught some genetic lectures in Framingham Women's Prison. A colleague of mine was teaching at BU and taught a course there, and she would bring in kind of these guest lecturers. I went there a few times, and that was the most powerful place I've ever taught genetics, and I want to do it again. And in Framingham Women's Prison, what I posed the question of, when is understanding genetics a good thing, and when is it a problem? I mean, it was the most amazing classroom, and it was women. They just nailed every question like right away. They were like, I was like, well, why is it a problem? And one woman raised her hand and she said, well, because people think we're here because it's inevitable, right? They think we're here because we were born with it, which is totally true. And I don't know if there's ever been a paradigm where genetic determinism has played out more than in criminology, right? Then I say, well, why might it be empowering for you to know? And another woman raises her hand and goes, well, I discovered that addiction in my family goes back several generations. And I was under the influence when I did the thing that got them incarcerated. So when she learned about the genetic roots of things, it kind of gave her this empower. And so diseases like addiction unquestionably have genetic roots. Unquestionably. And I think a responsible and careful understanding of this can help a lot of people without kind of dictating their fate. So I think depression, I think all these things have genetic roots and influences. I think the problem is, are they like we articulated with, are they like sickle cell, where it's a single thing that we're very, very clear we can CRISPR out of a population? No, not at all. And in fact, I think it was Emily Dickinson was the example that was in the Gattaca movie, right? That's the weird thing, and this is it, is that what happens, tell me I don't have an answer to this. I'd love to hear what you have to say. What would happen if we found that the genes associated with some of these disorders were associated with gifts? And I'm telling you right now, they are, because that's how biology works. What if we're already seeing correlations between people who are depressive and aspects of creativity? You want to if you get rid of one, you might be tweaking the other. And I think, so my point is, the answer is many mental health and behavioral things have genetic roots, but those things are tied to things that we may like about people, right? Like, I know I'm crazy. And sometimes I think I get that from my mother. And I think, but I think the things that drive people nuts about me, I think might be tied to the things that people, I don't know, I think I'm a little bit funny. No, whatever, fine, forget y'all. I think these things are
in good ways. In ways we don't wish to CRISPR
I think it's
out.
just complicated.
Yeah. Now the questions are rolling in. We have a question from Alex who says, I found it really interesting you started off by discussing Gattaca, because in the context of your main argument that environment cannot be disentangled from genetics, it feels like we live in a Gattaca-like society. Even if the genetic engineering is there, parents are investing in so much things like tutoring and extracurriculars and famous universities and all of that stuff, which is so dependent on wealth and privilege. So I see two diverging directions. One that is for a Gattaca-like society, where the ability to control phenotype is concentrated into the hands of the wealthy and privileged, and the other is a vision where we're confronting systemic racism and other systemic things, as you talked about. So the question that's posed is, how do you think that our research direction can lead us toward a realm where we're confronting the systemic discriminations rather than putting more power to control phenotypes into the hands of the ultra wealthy?
What a brilliant way of framing the issue there. What you basically said is, even without the genetic engineering, what we're doing is social engineering the opportunities for certain kids and certain people. And that's what inequality is, right? We give everybody like molecular biology camp, right? Like my offspring will have access to those types of things, right? And they will have kids are getting into daycare now, and it's like getting accepted into college. And so already you have these things. So what's interesting about what you're saying, though, is that I think the problem with genetic determinism, and this plays out in the film. In the film, you see the kid who does not have the good genetic profile. You see him getting shut out of schools because and what they sequence is, they don't want. So there's a lot in there that we can talk about. But to get to your question, how can we shift the paradigm towards one that's actually understanding the multiplicity of what it means to be a person and what talents are, and this Nexus model? How can we push the Nexus model into like research and policy? Well, I think that example I articulated about the Black men and women and their kind of differences, I think that's like there's a lot of examples like that. That's a sitting duck to be disentangled. You cannot explain that finding genetically because the genetic siblings don't have the same type of experience. And so what we need to do is identify problems like those and peel them apart using kind of cutting edge, sophisticated social science techniques. For example, the presence of fathers in that neighborhood, and that's a statistical effect that we should be able to name. We should be able to identify that. We should be able to expand that research program. And it may not be fathers, it might be a lot of things. We should be able to identify carefully what these forces are, what their statistical effect is, not unlike we do with genetic effects. So I think that's what the Nexus model does is it says, all right now what we do is we look at what the genetic effects are contributing to addiction, right? But in those models, we have such a narrow view of all of the contextual things which could be feeding into those effects. We don't even ignore them. We just treat them as noise. We try to control for them. I think there's a research paradigm where we welcome and embrace those things, and we reframe the question. If I want to think about what addiction is and what things underlie addiction, I should have all the variables in my model, not just the genetic ones, not just kind of, I should have whether or not the individual who I worked with in Framingham, a lot of them were from Fall River, Massachusetts, right? And they were explaining that community to me quite a bit. I should have the neighborhood you grew up in. I should reframe the problem, not one where I expect to find a slam dunk smoking gun gene, but one where I'm trying to figure out how the different types of factors are interacting. So if you reframe the question, it changes actually how you design a study, and it changes the type of answer you get, which then presumably will be actionable in terms of policy. So I would love to talk to you about that, Alex. Try to reach out to me, because this is really, really interesting the way you frame that.
Yeah. So many questions coming in. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. Following up on this, I want to ask, because I think this is a question that's practical for a number of people. This is from Hiwat Teste. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. Love your presentation. I've seen instances where people point to sickle cell anemia as evidence for why race and biology are inextricably linked, which always makes me super uncomfortable. Could you please comment on that and provide any insights to help people navigate those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty simple. I mean, do most Black people have sickle cell? The answer is like shocking, no. Hell no. Right. So if you use sickle cell as a marker for Blackness, by any definition, you're shockingly and embarrassingly wrong.
All right. That's okay. So that's the answer.
Yeah.
You're telling them shockingly and embarrassingly.
It is a marker for the people who have that trait, right? Like, you know what I mean? But like, I don't. Nobody in my biological family does. It is an adaptation that is localized to a certain geographic region. And are there white presenting people who do? The answer is yes. Right. So I think it's actually the opposite. Right. It's the example of how race and genetics do not link, because the trait does something very particular, has a very particular kind of adaptive history. And most people who are identified, either self-identified Black or Black, do not have that exact genetic profile. I wish every time I was racially profiled, I could simply say, oh, by the way, I don't have the sickle cell trait. That would get me nowhere in life, because it's not a useful proxy for how Black somebody is.
Right. Thank you. That's a great simple answer. You say no more compellingly than almost everybody. I wish we could have that. Ida asked this question following up on your answer where you said something about the two schools. And she asks, wouldn't epigenetics say that school B's better and richer environment could have affected the epigenetics of the students, even if you observe differences to school A's? In spite of it being a biology topic, wouldn't it put the responsibility back on the environment and bring the focus to finding long-term environmental effects?
Beautiful, excellent. Yes. So good and smart pushback, right? Like the idea is, even if you've identified, so what the epigenetics would say is that, well, school B had better environment, which influenced the way the genes function. Here's the question about epigenetics. Epigenetics effects are not especially reversible. So, right, so the idea here is that, and that's one of the things, once you've kind of, it's a chemical process through which the DNA is modified. So in some ways you'd be saying, if you use an epigenetic explanation there, you're saying that school B had the better environment, that influenced the epigenetics, which is why they're performing better, right? Now a policymaker says, you know what, that's really, really true. I agree with you, but the DNA has already changed in these populations. I can't do anything anymore. I have to wait till the next generation to change. So they can say, we'll do it next year, or we'll do it in 5 years, but this generation, the DNA has been changed. Right. So the idea is, that's the thing about biology. When you attribute something to biology is, biological explanations are almost intrinsically irreversible, in some ways. Right. And they can't be easily changed. Whereas social ones, you can change that overnight. We saw that happen within my mother's lifetime. Right. And I think that's where the challenge came in. Big, important topic. I'd love to kind of go in on that more. Gosh, I left time for questions, and there's so.
I know. I wish we'd had like 2
many.
hours
These
for
are-
questions.
we're
I have a
talking
long
about
list of
for
my own
hours.
questions. I got a long list of my own we're not even going to get to, but I'll have other opportunities to chat with you. I'm going to leave with one question because I'm quite curious about this one myself. You haven't talked at all about the microbiome. And wondering if you have thoughts about environment. This is a question from Anonymous. If you have thoughts about the effects of uterine and post-birth environment on the microbiome and expressions of disease in different populations.
The thoughts are, the answer is yes, and we don't know, but I'm sure they play a role. So the idea is this is another non-genetic modulator to the epigenetic point. So you have epigenetics, which should play a role. You have DNA that's in our bodies. We have epigenetics, which can change it. We have experience that can change it. We have setting, and then the microbiome is another dimension that's biological in some ways, but isn't tied to our genome. So the point is, if anything, the microbiome further makes the point that we need to pay attention to more stuff. And I think unquestionably that's going to be playing a role in we already know it plays a role in the way a lot of disease happens. So, no, I'm a fan, and I'm reading that literature, and I think the Nexus would be able to incorporate things like that.
All right. Well, I love it. I love it all. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been just really, really wonderful. So much fun. And for those of you who are here, remember, you can send your friends to the video. And I will remind everybody that our next talk is going to be February 23rd with the fabulous Kishana Gray, who's going to be talking about intersectional gaming. So that's going to be a good one, too. All right. Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Amazing questions. Reach out if you can.
Yeah, and thanks everybody who helped organize this and who's been here.
Yes, likewise, everybody.
All righty, thank you.